What's going on, boys and girls? This is Pete Clark and welcome to my big pot review video. These hands were freshly played at 200 zoom just this morning, and I'm going to get stuck into analysing them now and see which hands I played well, which hands I played less well, and what we can learn from this together. So let's go. In this first spot we have Ace King in the big blind. Villain opens to 2.5 BBs on the button and we decide to 3-bet to 12. Sometimes people ask me, they say, Pete, why do you size so big in the big blind? I noticed that in the small blind your sizing is smaller. What is this all about? This seems too big. Can you explain? And yes, I can. This is our small blind range. This comes from the solved ranges for 200 to 500 rake structures that are available at carrotcorner.com. You can click the top link in the comments to go over there and grab your very own solved ranges. This one is very linear, right? The small blind range contains a lot of good hands, but also a large cluster of mediocre hands as well. In the small blind, because we're not doing much flatting, we're actually 3-betting hands like 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, Queen Jack suited, King Jack suited, King 10 suited, Ace 10 suited, Ace Jack off, King Queen off. We're 3-betting all of these hands at full frequency, and what that really does is it kind of merges our range. That's to say, it makes it less polarized. So rather than our value region just being really big and wanting to play massive pots, we have this sort of thinner value region, this mediocre region that wants to play smaller pots. It does still want to pot build, but it doesn't want to cause too much of a filtering. It doesn't want to cause Villain to filter too much towards hands that are doing too well against us, basically. If we compare that to the big blind 3-bet range against button, this one is way more polarized. You can see that we're flatting now full frequency many of the hands that we were full frequency 3-betting when we were in the small blind. The reason for that is that calling is a much more lucrative thing when you're closing the action and you have better pot odds and you're not worried about somebody squeezing behind you. So it's normal here that we go a bit bigger in general, and solvers do slightly prefer a larger size pre-flop when you're in the big blind, because our value region now is predominantly just very big hands. We have way less of these thin value hands that want to pot build in a more modest way, and we have more of the very big value hands that just want to play huge pots. Our bluffs don't really care. If you checked out our last video called the 5 Principles of Bluffing, you would have learned in principle number 1 that the goal of bluffing is not to get more fold equity, nor is it to try and get less fold equity. The goal of bluffing is really to balance your value hands and just to have in some spots, and in other spots is to take advantage of a natural abundance of fold equity, whatever size you go. So your bluffs don't really care here. They're happy going big or they're going small. What really dictates whether you want to use a big 3-bet or a small one is how big your value hands want to go, and in the big blind we just have a larger concentration of the nuts when we're value betting. So we head over to a flop of Jack 4-3 two-tone. This is a board that I would use large bets on, and I elect to do that. I bet 60% pot. This is incredibly standard because we have a big nut advantage on this board, and when your nutted hands, just like pre-flop, are doing better, when they're less thin, less marginal, you're going to want to go ahead and pot build faster. However, when you have a more merged betting range, if this flop was Ace, Ace Jack or something, then I would be betting way more marginal hands like pocket kings, pocket queens there, and I would be using a small size, but my value range here is basically Ace Jack, King Jack, Queens, Kings, Aces, that sort of thing, set of jacks, and then some high equity draws, and of course bluffs as well like this. Ace King here isn't functioning as just a pure bluff, it's actually getting called by some hands that it beats, like flush draws and overcards with backdoors, and Ace 5, Ace Deuce, etc. if he has those. It's also getting some better hands to fold, so Villain will be pitching some combos of pocket 6s, pocket 8s, etc. here at some frequency, especially when those don't have the club. So we go ahead and do this. Villain calls, head over to the 3 turn. We can continue sort of value bluffing, quote unquote, here. By that, what I mean is that some better hands will fold and some worse hands will call, so it's not the case that Villain just calls in a linear fashion here. He actually is likely to call with Ace, Queen of Clubs, but fold a hand like pocket 7s at quite high frequency. So certainly betting again here is fine. That said, we don't want to be betting every single combo of Ace King here, so we elect to check this time. Villain goes for this bet. Now I'd like you to pause the video at this point and have a think about what you might do here. Is this a call? Is this a fold? Is this a jam? How would you play your hand and why? And when you've taken 5 seconds to do that, unpause and we'll take a look at what I did, and then take a look at a sim that shows what we should do. I hope you have now unpaused. So I actually elected to go all in here. I made a jam. Villain snapped off instantly with Jack 10 of spades, but we binked the river and we got him, boys, we got him. And that's the most important thing. It doesn't really matter how you play the turn, you just need to know whether the king is coming or not on the river, and that should be your criteria. Just kidding. This jam is actually, I suspected, theoretically okay, much to my relief, because I do get told off by the solver a lot, as you guys know if you watch this channel regularly. But this wasn't one of these times the solver didn't say, Pete, you're a moron, why did you do that this time? It actually said, yeah, that's the right combo of ace king to jam with here. And the very interesting thing here is that this hand is the right combo to jam because it's blocking ace jack and king jack suited. He doesn't have those in clubs, right? He has those in hearts, diamonds, and spades. It's actually unblocking his flush draws that may bet fold the turn or bet call the turn. We're doing well against those either way. And we have very good pair draw outs here, so when called we're doing fantastically well. At these low stack to pot ratios you do just want to do a lot of jam. Let's see what the solver thinks of this entire hand before we move on to the next one. So this is actually the ace king breakdown by suit. These are the ones that we want to shove on this turn node here. So we're looking to jam the ones that don't have the club in them. That's because we want the clubs to actually be bet folding or bet calling in villain's range here. If he's betting a hand like ace queen of clubs here, he'll be bet calling. If he's betting a hand like ace 5 of clubs here, he'll be bet calling. But if he's betting something like some lower flush draw like 8-7 of clubs, he'll be bet folding. So either way, this hand is doing well regardless of what he does with the draw. But the idea is we want him to have like king 10, king queen of clubs here that can bet fold as often as possible. We also want to block the suited jacks in his range because the offsuit ones don't really get here, and so we're not really expecting him to have king jack off very frequently here, but we do expect him to have king jack suited. Therefore the heart and the diamond that we have this combo in the middle here, ace of hearts, king of diamonds, middle, second row from the top, middle. This one is actually doing plenty of shoves, so as long as we don't fold turn there, we don't actually make a mistake, we can kind of do whatever we want in that spot. Jack 4 of hearts here, we've actually gone ahead pre-flop here and opened the button being called by the big blind. This is a reg, I believe, and we have gone for 1/4 pot on this flop. The way I'm building my flop strategies these days, guys, is that I'm either 1/4ing like this is actually 22% to be precise, or I'm over betting slightly. And the reason I would pick the 1/4 here is that villain's range is a bit less capped, our nut advantage is a bit less on a flop like ace 9-7, where he can have 7s, ace 7, ace 9 off, lots of combos of 2 pair, then some ace x as well that sort of counterfeited our kings, queens, jacks, 10s unique region from pre-flop. So whenever your unique hands, your overpairs are being seriously hurt like this, it's worthwhile considering sizing down on the flop. This counts for ace high boards, monotone boards, paired boards, and all kinds of spots like that. We get called here and we move on to the 5 of hearts turn. Interestingly, this hand is probably not as much of a mandatory value bet right now as you may think. I think when you've only bet small in the flop, it's a bit more urgent to bet here than if you've bet bigger. But there are times you can slow play flushes on turns in spots where it really doesn't look like you should. This time, however, I decided I would just bet this hand. I wasn't actually too sure in game about whether this was one of the flushes I'm allowed to check back here or not. I think most flushes are pure bets on this node, but I'm always surprised when I look at a solver and see the amount of slow playing that's going on here, even for the in position player. Villain raises here, and this is a very polarizing action, of course. So when you face a raise size like this, or a raise like this, it's a normal sizing of about pot, you're going to need to understand right away that an action like jamming is just not going to be warranted. If you jam here, what's going to happen is that your opponent will just have to fold all of his bluffs, and while there's a little bit of denial here, a hand like king queen with the king of hearts, or king 10 with the king of hearts, is not super live here anyway, nor is a hand like jack 10 or 6s with a heart, or 7-6 or whatever villain's deciding to raise on this node. He does have to adhere to some quite strict standards about what his bluff should be here, and they will very often need to contain a good heart. We have a very clear call. We're blocking king jack of hearts and king 4 of hearts. It's actually good here that our heart is a jack in a sense and not a king, because obviously a nut flush here would be a much better hand. We are happier with that, don't get me wrong, but in a sense here the jack of hearts does unblock more of the king x of hearts combos than the king of hearts does, so we're a bit more likely to be getting bluffed on the river when we have this hand than when we have the king of hearts. We do go for the call. The river comes at 8. Now it's interesting here, villain's value range, if you think back to the 5 principles of value betting, I will put the link to the video on your screen right now. Click it if you haven't seen this one. Do check it out, watch it later. It's really good just to see how you should be thinking about value betting. We also have one of these videos on bluffing that came out last week. But in that value betting principles video, we talked about the fact that the right sizing could well be jam in spots like this. Villain isn't concerned with maximizing how often we call him. What he should care about is actually winning as much money from our stack as possible when called. So jamming here makes a ton of sense for both his King X of Hearts combos and his King of Hearts X combos, meaning his flush draw hands. We do indeed face the annoying scenario where we get jammed on. I think this Four of Hearts is an incredibly good card here. It's just extremely unlikely that Villain is bluffing this river all in with a hand that contains the Four of Hearts, but he could be value betting all in with Queen 4 or King 4 of Hearts. The Jack of Hearts is also a pretty good card because I don't think it's that likely that he's jamming the Jack of Hearts here as a bluff, so we're unblocking bluffs with that card too. He could have a hand like Queen X Jack of Hearts or something sometimes, but I think the King of Hearts X combos are by far the most likely ones. We do elect to just call here without too much thought, and Villain rolls over. The bluff for King of Hearts 10X, I would maybe say as a caveat that if you're playing against someone whom you know to be really passive and just anti-bluffing in general, then they suddenly wake up and do this, you might want to hero fold here, but against a strong reg at 200 zoom, it's pretty much out of the question. Let's see what the solver thinks of this one. So the solver chooses to bet absolutely all of its range on this flop. This is normal when the sizing option is small and when we have a very large range advantage. Our range, according to the solver, is entitled to 39 chips out of a pot that's already just 55, so that's the vast majority of the pot belongs to us, the in-position player, because our range is so much stronger than our opponents, and due to that, we're going to be betting very wide for value, taking advantage of high fold equity here. As you can see, we're actually getting a 38% fold equity by betting 22% pot here. That's way above the mathematical norm, but it's based on the fact the ranges are not equal. Villain is getting here with a very big disadvantage, and we capitalize on that by doing a lot of betting, denying equity to his hands, bluffing very profitably, and also value betting wide, given we have a lot of value bettable holdings for such a small sizing. Villain decides to call this time, and the turn comes the Five of Hearts. Now when you look at the flushes here and what they're up to, the ones that are slow playing are actually just going to be the lower ones. I wasn't sure if Jack 4 here was going to be allowed to do any checking, and it turns out that it's not. It's just slightly too big and is experiencing an EV loss of 3 chips here. This is a 5-10 game, so it's like, imagine playing 5-10 at the Bellagio or something and losing $3 by not betting here. It's not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but $3 is $3. This kind of thing adds up quickly. This is of course just theoretical, but yeah, the solver thinks we are $3 in the 5-10 game worse off for not betting that hand. However, if we go down to one of our lower flushes here, such as the 8-6 of Hearts or the 9-8 of Hearts, you can see that it's no longer important whether we bet or check the turn. And the concept that's at play here, guys, is something I call an investment ceiling. Basically, by the end of the hand, the investment ceiling for something like 8-6 of Hearts is a lot lower. That hand will not be as adamant on building a gigantic pot as the Jack High, Queen High or King High flush will be. You can see that these hands start to be really full frequency bets. Interestingly, some King High flushes as you work your way up actually start doing a bit of slow playing again. This isn't due to hand strength, but it's due to blockers. When you have King Jack of Hearts, you're going to be both blocking your opponent's calling range and his bluff raising range and his value raising range. So you're basically going to be crushing the deck a little bit harder. And generally in poker, when it comes to picking your slow plays in position on the turn, you want to be betting everything that's nutted and unblocking the continuing range, which is why you see like Queen 4 or Jack 4 just always bet here. You want to be checking sometimes with hands that are a bit weaker and are just not nutted tier of hand, and you want to be checking some hands at the very top that completely crush the deck and destroy your opponent's ability to continue. Interestingly and fascinatingly here, when you have King Queen of Hearts, it's actually a pure check, so finding the right slow plays on this turn is far from easy. We do go for a bet in this instance because we weren't sure that checking was okay. Whenever I'm not sure that one line is okay but I know the other one is, I will always choose the line that I know is okay. That's much better than mixing and sometimes possibly making a blunder. Villain decides to raise here. I'm going to use this sizing as it's the most common one in the sim, and it's also the one that he was closest to with his raise size here. And as you can see, we don't play any 3-bet range here. There's absolutely none of that going on. Our hand is a mandatory call. If we were to fold here, we would lose $226 in the 5-10 game compared with calling. Going all in is also a big EV loss here. Shoving just doesn't make any sense. That loses nearly $100, but $80 to $90. So easy call. I'm looking at the EV numbers there in the solver, by the way. That's a very important skill. A lot of people forget to do that. They just look at what the solver is choosing to do, but they don't look at how bad it would be to do the other line, right? You want to think about how far the swing would be between option A and option B, not just say, oh, the solver's doing X, so I'm going to do X. You don't want to be a copycat in poker. It's not a good way to learn. As you can see here, Villain plays the spot on the river very well. He can have 2 bet sizes available to him, 75% pot one, and then just a jam for the rest of the money. The jam is the most frequent one because most of his value hands are just the nut flush, and you can see that these hands actually lose some EV by not jamming. This is very standard in a spot where his range is really polar, and thus we're not going to be raising his small bet very often. If he bets smaller here, we're only raising 25% of the time, and many of those raises are just the nuts anyway. When he has the King of Hearts, he'll actually reduce our raise frequency to nearly nothing, and therefore he doesn't really want to slow play one of these hands like King 10, King 4, King 3, King Deuce, Queen Deuce of Hearts. These just want to shove. Villain shouldn't really be shoving too many weaker flushes than our hand. If we go down to the 10-9 of Hearts, we can see that these hands actually stop shoving and start B75ing, betting 75% of the pot. And you can see here that these are just bluffs down here that are doing this. There are no weak flushes that are actually picking a smaller sizing. That means that when he does jam, our hand is what we call a bluff catcher in grade 2 of the Carrot Poker School. Now, a bluff catcher is a hand that beats every value bet in Villain's range, but beats every bluff in Villain's range, but doesn't beat any of his value bets. For that reason, bluff catchers will sometimes fold and sometimes call based on their blocker properties. So we have other hands that are also bluff catchers here, like pocket nines. The idea with this hand is that we're beating every bluff, but we're not beating any value hands, and therefore it's really just down to the blocker properties of the hand whether we call. Jack 4 is of course just way too good a call. The blockers are immense. If we were to fold here, we would lose $310. That's 31 big blinds we would be swinging. This hand is incredibly standard, and that's why I said we don't fold here unless we have a very acute read. It's not enough just to be like, oh, I think this spot's under bluffed, I'm going to fold. That's not good enough. People could be bluffing infrequently here, but the hand is just so good theoretically that you just don't want to make that big a deviation. And that's why in our poker school and in our Discord and just in all of my content, I basically preach the mantra that we need to be knowing how far we're deviating. We need to have a theoretical base before we start making hero folds and stuff like that. Folding any flush here is going to be a deviation, but I'm okay with folding a hand like 8-6 of Hearts if I'm just really confident that the guy's under bluffing. That's a 9 big blind swing. It's still really strong, but it's nowhere near a 31 big blind swing, and so it's a much sooner that we're going to arrive at folding 8-6 of Hearts here than we are at folding Jack 4. So it's really good to know just how far you're deviating. This third and final hand is not really a spot I want to run in a solver. It's just more of a general thought process. This is played against a weaker player, and so we're going to just use common sense and logic here more than anything else to determine what we should do. So we get here with ace king of clubs and we decide to squeeze 13 big blinds, which is normal. We just always want to be trying to isolate this player, and this player calls. This is a great situation for us, but then unfortunately we sort of half whiff the flop. This is a really misplayed spot by my students in general. I see people mess this spot up all the time, and I want to talk a bit about how we can make this spot smoother for us to understand and get our head around. So one thing that we don't want to do here is make a large bet, and the reason for that is it's going to split our opponent's range in a very unuseful way where we sort of force him to continue pairs. He'll be jamming a lot with pairs, he'll be continuing some draws, but he'll also just mostly be folding hands that we dominate. I think by far the best way to play a spot like this against a recreational player is to start off with a check, allow our villain to make some bad bets here, allow him to bet a hand like the ace-3 of diamonds for no reason, allow him to bet the king-jack of spades, a hand that we're totally crushing. With this little amount of money left behind, with so few chips left in the stacks here compared to the big pot, one thing you're going to want to do a lot at this stack to pot ratio is shove, as we talked about before. The reason you'll want to shove here is that your hand is again a kind of value bluff denial. It's kind of a jack of all trades. We're getting value here from hands like jack 10, queen jack, and to some extent it's not impossible that villain could just be some tilted stationary player that just bet calls off ace queen here or something like that. The main points of this raise though are to deny equity to a hand like jack 10, queen jack, queen 10 if he does fold. It's not even a terrible thing to get your opponent to fold like 7-5 or some loosey-goosey hand like that, 7-6. These are good too, and it's obviously important to try to get him to sometimes fold better. Now that's not usually going to be happening. If your opponent has a hand like fives here, he will be folding sometimes. Some recreational players will bet with fives, trying to like find out what's going on. You'll shove and they'll decide that they put you on an overpair and they'll fold. Other times they'll just stubbornly call it off with every single pair. But the point is that if you surveyed 1,000 humans here and asked them, do you fold fives here or not, some of them would fold. Maybe it's only 200, but some of those 1,000 players would fold. And so there are elements of bluffing, elements of value betting, and elements of denying equity to this jam. So I believe this jam is just totally fine. Very important that we start off with the check here, just to allow our opponent to invest as wide as possible. And then this is going to be good, because if we do run into one pair that calls here like 8-7, 5-6s, 10s, we're going to have a ton of equity. If we run into something lower than 8s, we even have an 8 as an out as well. Don't forget that. We have backdoors here, we have all kinds of things. Villain does actually call it off in this hand with pocket fives, but the interesting thing is that on the flop, when we got it in this hand, PokerStars actually came up and said, you've now got 40% equity or something like that. I think this 39 here is like what our equity is against any two cards, because it's saying we have 61. That's not right, ignore that. We actually have about 40% here against a hand like 5s or 7s or 6s. That's huge. We can also have the best hand, we can get useful fold equity. The way to play this spot at this SPR, guys, is to check and then jam on the flop. It is not to bet, and it's not to check fold. That would be very bad. So very happy with the play of this hand. Unfortunately, you can't win them all. We do get the board pairing, but not with the right card. We need like another thing that would make us win is like runner queens or runner 10s or something like that, when our opponent has 6s, 5s, 4s, that portion of his range. So really instructive hand. Playing out of position in low SPR situations against weaker players, you very often just want to check raise. It's just a staple. If I had aces here, I might actually check call, but if I had something like jacks or queens or 10s, I'd definitely be check raising as well as something like jack 10. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you like the way that we talk about the game here at carrotcorner.com, then you might want to check out our mega bundle. Our resident pro James has been hard at work compiling lots of episodes of this exploitative e-magazine for your reading pleasure. In Pio versus Population, we basically give you a roadmap for how the spot should be played in theory, but then we show you how our opponents are misplaying it, how to punish them, and step 3 is simple, you just profit. The mega bundle is episodes 1 through 10, all at a discounted rate, $44.99 for basically 150 to 160 pages of reading pleasure, and this is the quickest and most acute way to inject some very profitable exploitative ideas straight into the bloodstream of your game. This has been Pete Clark. We'll have more regular YouTube content coming for you very soon. In the meantime, please do like and subscribe. The more subs I get, the bigger this channel gets and the more content I'm going to be able to put out. So please do that, and I will see you guys on the next video. Much love and bye for now.